Before watching this video, you should first watch the video named Use the Table to Evaluate Functions.
In the table video, you learn how to use the calculator's table to evaluate a function at various points. Also, you learn how to set up the table with the Table Set option. In this video, you will use the calculator's table and evaluate two functions at various points, and then find the sum and product of the two functions. The vars key will be used to find the sum and product of each function. The function values will be shown numerically through the use of the table, and each function will be shown graphically. Before we use the table function, let's make sure the settings for the table are correct. So remember how to do that. We would go into the table set by hitting second function and then this particular button here because it says table set. So we hit the window button. The most important thing we want to look at is that the independent variables are on ask and the dependent variables are on auto. What this does is it allows you to input your values of x that you want in the table for the x values, and it will automatically give you back the corresponding values for y. That's why it's here on auto. Okay, so this is set up correctly. These particular values don't have any meaning when it's set on ask and auto here. Okay, so let's go ahead and quit out of this. Alright, so for the first example, we're going to let f of x equals negative x plus 3. That's our first function. Then we're going to let the second function, g of x, equal x squared minus 2. Then we're going to want to find the sum of f of x and g of x, and the sum of both of those functions is going to be represented by h of x. Then h of x equals f of x plus g of x. Now, remember we input the functions by going to the y equal button. We're going to let y1 be represented by f of x, and then y2 is going to be represented by g of x. Okay? So f of x is negative x plus 3, and then we go ahead and hit enter. Okay, and that moves down to the next line, or you could use the arrow key to go down. Doesn't matter. And then the y2, remember, is representing g of x, and that is x squared subtract 2. Now remember that h of x is equal to f of x plus g of x. So we want y3 to be the sum of y1 and y2. So let's move down. Now we could actually type in, the sum of these two by saying minus x plus 3 plus x squared minus 2. We can put that all down here. But an easier way to do this is to simply use the vars key, this key right here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and hit vars, and then we move over to y vars. Okay, and then we want the function. So we hit enter, and then we want y1. That's the first function we're using. So we hit enter. Okay, then you can see it puts in y1 here. Well, we want the sum of y1 plus y2. So then we hit the sum button, and then we're going to go back into vars, go to y vars, so we move the cursor over, and then we want number 1, the function, so we can either hit number 1 or just simply hit enter. So let's do that. And we want number 2 because we want y2. So we'll hit number 2. And there we have it. The y3 is represented by y1 plus y2, or h of x is equal to f of x plus g of x. Okay? We're representing h of x being y3, g of x was y2, and then f of x is y1. So now let's go ahead and go to the table. So if we hit second function, and then here's the table, so we hit graph. Now the values of x that are going to be used are -2, 0, 1, and 5. So let's input these values. -2, enter. Now notice that when we substituted -2 in for x, it automatically gave back our y1 and our y2 value. So it's going to do that each time we input a value for x. So let's put in 0 and then enter, 1 and then enter, and 5 and enter. So here's the corresponding values for y1 and y2, and just remember this was our f of x and then this is our g of x. Now you're probably wondering where the y3 is. Remember, y3 represented the sum of these two. Okay? So let's just take a look at the first one. If you wanted the sum of y1 and y2 evaluated at -2, then that's going to be 5 plus 2, which is 7. So if I move over on the cursor, now it's showing y3. So remember I said 5 plus 2 was 7, and there it is. And then it's taking the other y1 and y2 and adding it together, and you get 1, and then you get 1 again, and then you get 21. So let's go ahead and graph this. Now you could plot these points, okay? So you could plot -2, 5, that's an ordered pair, 0, 3 is an ordered pair, 1, 2 is an ordered pair, and 5 minus 2 is an ordered pair. And the same for the other function, -2, 2, 0 minus 2, 1 minus 1, and 5, 23. Okay, for that particular function, which was g of x. And then you could plot the ordered pairs for y3, so it would be -2, and then we scroll over. So it would be -2, and then 7, 0, and 1, 1, and 1, and 5, and 21. Alright, so let's just go ahead and graph each one of these functions. So it's going to graph f of x, g of x, and the sum of both functions, which we called h of x. So if we hit graph, there it graphs the line, then the parabola, and then the third function right here that it just drew is the sum of this linear function plus this parabola. Alright? Okay, so let's go to example number 2. Now we're still going to use these same functions. We're going to use f of x being minus x plus 3 and g of x being x squared minus 2. This time though, h of x is going to be the product of f of x and g of x. Now we can go back to where the functions are inputted and change y3. Now it says y1 plus y2, we want the product. So we could simply go down and change that to a multiplication symbol. Okay? And then we'd be done. But what I'd like to do is I just want to repeat how you use the vars key. So let me go ahead and just clear this line. So we've already inputted the f of x and the g of x. That's the same as it was in example 1. Now remember, for example number 2, y3 is the product of y1 and y2. So an easy way to do that is you go to vars, and then you move the cursor over to yvars. Then you hit enter to get the function. And then we want y1, so we just hit enter. Okay, then remember it puts in y1. Now we want the product, so we put the multiplication symbol in there. And then we want y2 to be here. So we go back to vars, move it over to yvars using the cursor. And then we want the function, so we hit enter. And we want y2 this time, so we hit number 2. And there it puts in y2. So here we have the product of y1 and y2, and that's represented by y3, and remember that's our h of x. Okay? So the same thing, let's go to the table. Recall that we have already selected our values for x, -2, 0, 1, and 5. So these values will remain the same for y1 and y2. What's going to change are the values at y3. So if we scroll over to y3, we should see the product of y1 and y2. So 5 times 2 is 10. So if we move over for y3, there it is. There's 10 for y3. And let's just go to the last one. Okay, since you understand what's happening now, let's move over to y1. So the product of y1 and y2 is simply minus 2 times 23, which would give us a negative 46. So let's scroll over to y3, and there's our negative 46. Now let's just take a moment to think about what the graph of y3 would look like. We already know that y1 is a linear function, that's a straight line, and we already know that y2 is a quadratic. Just go back to look at that. So here's our linear, here's our quadratic, but what would the product of these two be? Well, if you can kind of imagine in your head, if you're taking the product of this function and this function, you know our highest degree is going to be 3. When you multiply minus x and x squared, you're going to get something cubed. Okay, so this product is going to be a cubic function. So if we go ahead and go to the graph button, there's our linear function, here's the parabola, and then we have our cubic function. So here is the cubic function. All right, so that's the product of this linear function and the parabola. The product of those two gives us this cubic right here. I would like to continue with one more example involving the vars key. If we go to y equals, let's input a linear function y equals 2x subtract 4. And let's quickly graph this. So you can see here's our linear function. Now if we go back into where we inputted the function, and let's go down to y2. Let's say that we wanted to input the square root of this function. You can simply go second function, then the square root, and then we're going to take the square root of y1. So we would go vars, and we move over to y vars, and then we want the function, so select enter, and then select y1, enter, and then close the parenthesis, and now let's graph that. So there's the square root of that particular function right there. And if we go back into where the functions are inputted, now if we wanted to take the absolute value of, let's say, y1 and then subtract 5 from it, we can go math and then move over to num, absolute value, select enter, and then we want the absolute value of y1. So we would go to vars, move over to y vars, and we want function, select enter, then we want y1, select enter, close the parenthesis, and let's subtract 5. We graph that. So here's the graph of the absolute value of y1 subtract 5. As you can see, the use of the vars key is very handy and useful when graphing functions. This concludes the video on using the table when graphing two functions and the use of the vars key.